Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. Today I'm talking about the 1920 silent version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on the Kino Lorber Blu-ray release, termed their Deluxe edition. This, of course, is the famous 1920 silent version of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic novella that was adapted into a stage play by Thomas Stephenson, and this version sort of became the de facto new standard of the story and injected a lot of new material, changed things around quite a bit in terms of the overall tonality and the actual character nature of Jekyll himself. And then this became adapted into various films, particularly the three major versions: the 1920 silent version, the 1931 Paramount Sound remake, that's one of the notable pre-code classics, and then the significantly toned down MGM 1941 version directed by Victor Fleming. And all of these are actually based not on Stevenson's original novel, but the stage play version, which gives Jekyll a love interest and tries to make him a bit more saintly and does significantly alter a number of elements from the original novella. So I myself personally, while I love things in all three versions, and it's pretty obvious that the 1931 version is the classic cinematic version of the Jekyll and Hyde story, none of them quite do Stevenson's original novella, and that always kind of bugs me a little bit because while I'm the stage play itself, the changes that it made in the story is fine, and all three films have great strengths and phenomenal lead performances by their respective actors in the dual role of Jekyll and Hyde. It never quite adds up to what I love about Stevenson's original novella, and no one's really ever quite done Stevenson's original story because it's told much more as sort of a mystery story, really, from the other perspectives. And with Jekyll and Hyde being so well known today and throughout pop culture, it's kind of hard to do that. So you'd have to basically sort of have a more almost old-fashioned mystery, sort of Victorian era set tale that exactly the way the novella was written, and just ignore the fact that everybody knows the twist of the story. But yeah, I think it would be very striking to do, and some versions get a little bit closer to that than others. But the three particular film versions, starting with this 1920 adaptation, sort of changed the whole popular view of the Jekyll and Hyde story, and it's fascinating to see how each of the three films sort of play around with that a little bit. And honestly, when you look at this 1920 version, it actually sticks a little bit closer to the original novella in certain aspects, and it may be actually a tad bit more realistic than the other two versions, even though it is the silent version, and you can recognize the direct parallels that are to scenes in the original Stevenson work. Those are a bit shifted around or even completely missing in the 31 and 41 versions. So I think it's important to look at all three, and frequently when people talk about Jekyll and Hyde versions and you get to talking about the primary important ones, the focus is always on the sound films of 31 and 41. So this version quite frequently gets overlooked, and while it's in the public domain, it's usually available in nothing but really terrible versions. So that's why I thought it was important to talk about the Kino release. And so since I delved into the Warner Archive releases of the other two versions, it got me thinking about the 1920 version again. So I decided to talk about the newest and best version, which is the Kino Deluxe Edition Blu-ray. Now, of course, the reason why you come to the 1920 version is for John Barrymore's lead performance in the dual role of Jekyll and Hyde. Barrymore is one of the most legendary actors of his entire generation, and quite frankly, of all time, and with deserved good reason. Not only was he one of the most legendary actors in terms of the stage and in terms of Shakespearean roles, but he translated over into films almost effortlessly. I mean, he just has that same charisma that you can only imagine, since obviously we never got to see him on stage because, of course, he died long before any of us were ever born. You get that sense of, at least this must be what some of his stage performances, his most celebrated ones, would have been like. So to have Barrymore coming to this role and attacking it with his incredible vigor and really hyping up the two distinct sides of Jekyll and Hyde. This, I think, of the three main versions, might be the most distinct separation between the two, because the actual script and the tone and what the film tries to do, they try to really make Jekyll as saintly as possible, in terms of that he's too good for words and that he has no baser instincts, and all he is trying to do is promote the good ideals of mankind and human kindness. And Barrymore really portrays that internal sense of the never-ending do-gooder, the person who is not trying to be a saint per se, but has those sort of internal aspirations, and they sort of weigh down on him. So it's like he's carrying all this baggage of he has to do good because it is inside him, and he must prevail in being as good of a human being as he can be. Those people are, of course, extraordinarily rare in the real world, but you immediately recognize this from the opening scene and how Barrymore attacks the material. So when he does do the transition into Hyde, it is a complete about face, and the what Stevenson wrote about in the novella, the sort of loosening and unleashing of the baser instincts. All of this is made much more explicit in the 1931 version, and Frederick March's performance. And of course, the benefit of being an actual sound film. But here, Barrymore has to work only with his physicality. And of course, the most famous thing about the 1920 version is, like the 1931 version, the transformation is done entirely in camera and is performance-based. But Barrymore has to do it without the aid of makeup. They do start adding little bits of makeup in the transformations in some of the cutaways, but the primary transformation sequence itself, particularly the first one, is all done in camera in one take and is entirely performance-based, as it would be on the stage. So you get that sort of sense of, once again, sort of being able to imagine what it would have been like to see Barrymore himself on stage. But it's remarkable what he's able to do with his physicality. And of course, it is a silent film, so people today might look at it now and would immediately go to the overacting label. But you do need a degree of that to really get across the physical and mental changeover that's happening in this transformation. And without the ability to have dialogue or sound, the performance does have to be a bit bigger than it would normally be in order to convey this. So it's not a matter of overacting, or the scene frequently gets put out in clip compilations and things because it's public domain. So people may have seen some bits of this, but when taken in the proper context, it's an absolutely riveting performance, and that's the Barrymore is the main draw of why you come to this film. But it's a well-made silent adaptation, actually, even though it is based on the stage play, so it's not exactly doing Stevenson's novel. In some ways, again, as I mentioned before, it kind of is, of the three, actually the closest to what Stevenson put down on the page. I think that Barrymore's version of Hyde is actually probably the closest to the Hyde of the book, in terms of he's very scheming, but he doesn't have the sort of animalistic tendencies of the 1931 version, where they really play up the ape-like Neanderthal man idea. And the 1941 version, when Spencer Tracy plays it, it's all psychologically based, and it's very internalized, and it's very chilling in that way. And it's a brilliant performance, but the teeth of the story are removed because it's right smack dab in the middle of MGM 1941 full production code enforcement. So that film basically retreads the 1931 version, but with all the teeth and the bite of the story just ripped out. So all you can do is study the internalization and the psychology of the character. However, the 1941 version does get back a bit to what's in the 1920 version. The 1920 version is the one that is the most tragic of the three, by making Jekyll so saintly and making his downfall into Hyde over time a gradual fall down into the abyss. It is the version of the three that most stresses the tragedy of the Jekyll and Hyde story. Whereas the other two versions, there's a degree of that, but the 1931 version is so gleeful that you don't quite get as much of that tragic sort of feeling, and Jekyll and Hyde are not as polar opposite as they are in the 20 version. And then in the 1941 version, they add a bit back of that tragic feeling to the Tracy version of Jekyll trying to go through his experiments for the benefit of mankind, but it also is sort of self-serving, just like the 1931 version really goes for. So all three are playing with the same sort of they're all playing with the same bag of toys, essentially, but they all do things and put it together in different ways, and they're all dictated by the time in which they were produced. So if you're a fan of the novel or you've read the novel a lot, you will recognize the story beats in all three, but the 1920 version is the only one that really has the much more direct parallels. Like, for example, it even does one of the most notable sequences from the book when Hyde is out and about and does the unbelievably dastardly deed of simply stomping a child in the middle of the road and then being caught red-handed, and then does the bit of having to get money for recompensation, goes into the back door and comes out with a check written by Jekyll, leading Jekyll's friends to think that for some reason this Hyde character has blackmail power over Jekyll. That's one of the nice center point scenes of the actual original book. There's not exactly a direct parallel in the other two versions. There are stills, apparently, of the 1931 version of that scene perhaps being shot, but of course probably being removed because it is quite a graphic idea. But only in the 1920 version do you have some direct parallels of scenes being replicated from the original Stevenson story. But again, you do have the insertion of all the things from the stage play, like the love interest, who of course is the daughter of the father figure that Hyde manages to finally exact his revenge over. But interestingly, here, that father character isn't the sort of symbol of Victorianism as he is in the other two versions. Here, he is pretty much the person who sets Jekyll on the path of becoming Hyde and encourages this stuff indirectly. Some have said that gives this version a bit of the flavor of A Picture of Dorian Gray, along with the fact that as Hyde continually comes back and Jekyll continually transforms into Hyde, that Hyde becomes uglier and more physically misshapen in things. And this idea carries over into both the 1931 and 41 versions, particularly, of course, the 1931 version, where by the end, Hyde is a complete inhuman monster and is completely deteriorated over how he first appeared. Here you have that in some degree, but again, the 31 version takes that idea and runs with it the most. The 41 version has that a little bit as well. So both the sound versions do draw heavily from the 1920 version. In fact, the 1931 version was originally started by Paramount because they had the rights and they made this 1920 version. The 1931 sound version was started as a sound talkie remake, and Barrymore was approached to reprise his role, but he was at another studio, I believe MGM, by this point. So that's how it wound up going to Frederick March as sort of the trying to get a Barrymore-esque type. So the 1931 version is not only remaking the 1920 story, but it was designed to be a direct talkie remake of the 1920 version. So that's why there are so many direct parallels, because it's literally Paramount trying to just do a talkie remake of their very successful 1920 version that we have here, starring John Barrymore. So while not everyone is a fan of silent films these days, it does take a bit getting used to if you're not into silent films. This is actually, I think, a good one for people to delve into, because anything in the horror realm is generally viewed as a bit more approachable, and since horror is a genre that has never lost its popularity and seems more popular than ever now, so this might be a good title to perhaps try if you're dipping your toes into silent films. And Barrymore's performance is absolutely riveting and still haunting and eerie, so it's an incredibly effective silent film, even though it fell into the public domain and has seen a whole host of different versions with different run times, different color timings, different scores. Some are missing footage. So you do want to find a good version, and I do think this Kino Blu-ray is the best one to date, and it is actually complete with color tinting and a good score. So while you might find versions online or even on YouTube, you'll find them everywhere because, again, it's in the public domain. I do think that with bigger and important silent films like this, it is very important to go and find the best available restored version, because the difference in your viewing experience will be just it's impossible to say how much of a different experience you get, especially when you're seeing a film for the first time. When you see a properly restored silent film, or at least the best available version, compared to the god-awful copies that are usually floating around. So again, I do highly recommend seeking out this Kino release, especially for newcomers to this film. Don't go with the all the janky versions you might find online. So to talk about the Blu-ray release and the picture quality, this is the newest or best available restoration of the film. It is a newer scan. It's basically an update of what Kino had put out on DVD before, but unfortunately their old disc was missing. I think it was about 5 minutes of footage. So thankfully the film is once again complete. It is color tinted, and the tinting is actually quite nice. It does vary to a good degree, so it's not just the same sort of blanket tint throughout. Of course, the night scenes are of course tinted a sort of dark blue. The day scenes are sort of like an amber yellow to suggest sunlight. There is some pink and brown tinting as well. So I think the image overall for the presentation does look nice, and it is the best I've ever seen the film in terms of visual quality. However, it does have many baked-in issues due to the sources that are available. As with most silent films, you are limited to the available sources, so this does seem to be primarily, almost entirely compiled from 35mm footage, which is great because most silent films you do have to dip into 16mm. It does seem like they had to do that for two particular sequences. Most notably, there is a sort of there is a story told, and it's not a flashback, but it's a flash into the actual visuals of the story being recounted. And that and one other sequence are substituted from lesser quality sources. There is a big quality drop off, and they're also window boxed for some reason. That seems to be something that a number of silent film restorations do when they have to go to lesser quality footage. And I guess the idea is to sort of not have the lesser visual quality of the other source be magnified by being the same full frame as the rest of the transfer. However, it's just as notable when all of a sudden you get 2 minutes in a transfer and it's completely window boxed, but that's just how they did it here. Thankfully, this is complete and it is color tinted. This is some of the material that was missing from the previous Kino disc. All this is available on the old image release on Laserdisc and DVD. I have the Laserdisc behind me, and when you look at the footage on there, it's not actually color tinted, and it's also of lesser quality. So this is still a bit of an upgrade, and the overall improvement over the old Image Master, which was a different preservation print, a different color timing, and a different score. This is a significant leap forward in technical presentation quality. But once again, there is a lot of baked-in damage. There are some pretty big hairs, there's tears, speckles, scratches all over the place. This is not a meticulous frame-by-frame, brand new 4K scan and restoration, for example. It is more of a sort of preservation restoration, and it is the best available to date. But you are going to notice issues aplenty. There is a sort of side edge of the frame problem that happens in a number of points, where you literally have the side edge of the frame look like it was severely damaged. So it's not quite exposing any light, but that is something that does creep in a couple points. That's probably the single biggest transfer issue that you'll notice, but that is all inherent to the source. And this is apparently the best 35mm source that's available for the film. So in spite of all the baked-in issues and things, and the fact that those 2 bits are window boxed from a lesser source, it is the complete version of the film. The color tinting is really good, and this is the best presentation I've ever seen of the film. And so I think it's the best version to date, and no one has come around and done a new scan. It's it would be harder to get somebody to want to finance it because, of course, it's in the public domain. It's a silent film. The audience will be limited, and anybody who's curious can just look up and watch whatever crappy free version is floating around online. But for those really interested, I do think this is the best version to date. It doesn't really have any major issues in terms of what you see on some of the more problematic silent films on Blu-ray because, of course, the frame rate wreaks havoc with the Blu-ray standard because the idiots who designed the Blu-ray standard didn't think that they should include things like differing frame rates for silent films at 16 to 20 frames per second. Now, there have been some who have complained that this transfer might have some frame rate issues. I personally didn't notice anything egregiously bad like what you see on Kino's Phantom of the Opera release, for example. It is still definitely possible they're there, and I do think there is room for improvement, obviously, if somebody was to come in and do a new, even just a 2K scan, and do all new work from scratch to improve upon this master. But until somebody comes in and does new work, I think this is the best version of the film to date, and this would be the version that I would recommend to people. It's also sometimes included in Kino Lorber's site sales, and when it's there, it's very inexpensive. So this is, I think, the best recommendable version of the film. Now, in terms of the score, it's a score originally made for Kino's release by the Montalto Motion Picture Orchestra. I think it's a very good score, and actually I think it's actually at least I prefer it over the already very good Gaylord Carter score on the old Image release. So I do think it's a good score, and it really enhance the viewing experience. It is presented in lossless quality. The problem is apparently when this disc was mastered, most people may not notice this, but it is it's actually pretty obvious. It's because it happens right in the opening credits. There are several points where there is distortion in the actual track itself. This is not seemingly part of the recording, but there is crackle and distortion due to the signal being compressed or something going on in the actual mastering of this new HD presentation of the audio. I don't have the older Kino discs to see if it's present on there, but I've tried to look around. Some people have also noticed this, so thankfully it's not just me driving myself crazy. But for some reason, when this disc was mastered, the audio track, while it does sound overall excellent, there are several points starting in the opening titles where when there are loud crescendos and basically bigger parts of the musical accompaniment, there is crackle and distortion in the high end. So, and it seems to be channel based because it's almost entirely always in the left channel. That's really unfortunate because otherwise, I could give the audio a clean bill of health and say it's excellent throughout. I do really like the score. It is now my preferred score for this film, but it's just unfortunate that there's that distortion baked into how this disc was mastered, because apparently I've seen some discussion with others, and apparently it's not on Kino's old DVD with the same score track. So that's unfortunate. I wish it wasn't there. It does kind of mar the audio presentation a little bit, but thankfully it's so infrequent that you do kind of forget about it and you're able to just get on with the film. But it will happen at several points in the transfer. So those with better systems or more discerning ears, you will notice that right off the bat. To talk about the packaging a little bit, it's just a standard Blu-ray case with actually rather nice art. This is done in the same style Kino was doing for silent films. They did a number of Chaney films with a similar sort of stylized art cover. I really like the simplicity of the image. It has a sort of classy feel, and they have a little bit of color tinting on the actual imagery. The disc itself is like other Kino classic silent releases from this time period, just a plain label, no booklet or anything. And then the rear with your listing of extras, and this has the sort of traditional blue and white box listing all the specs and features like a lot of Kino silent releases do. Now, to talk about the extras, there are actually quite a number of them here. So, of course, the first listing is, of course, the new HD master made for this particular release from 35mm Elements, except for the bits that were slugged in from a lesser source. The musical score by the Montalto Motion Picture Orchestra, as was on the previous Kino release. Then there's an inclusion of the 1912 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which stars James Cruise. This was on previous releases, but in an incomplete form. It runs 12 minutes here. It's obviously very simplistic, but it's fascinating to see the entirety of the earlier 1912 silent adaptation, which again, is a fascinating time capsule, obviously not as complex as the 1920 version, but still fascinating nonetheless, and really fun to see it in its complete form. Then there is a 15-minute cut of various scenes and bits from the rival 1920 version that was produced by Louis B. Mayer, that is essentially a direct rival, intended to rival the Paramount Barrymore version. It's nowhere near as good, obviously, and it's not presented in its entirety. It's just 15 minutes of various clips and bits. But it's fascinating to actually see any footage of this other version, because it's interesting to see what a rival production done at the same time of the same source material could do. Again, there's nothing like Barrymore's performance in this version, so you'll find yourself just sort of curiously glancing at this, but yeah, it's not very good. Then there is a really fun little, actually pretty lengthy slapstick short called Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride, which is actually starring Stan Laurel, sort of riffing on the Jekyll and Hyde idea. And it looks pretty good. It looks like it's maybe an SD upscale. The only problem is, unfortunately, it cuts off rather abruptly at the end. So I guess that's just how the source that survives is, and maybe the very ending is damaged or something. But it's still fun nonetheless. And of course, any bit of Stan Laurel is always welcome. So that was a nice touch to add here. And then there's also a 1909 audio recording from a audio version of Jekyll and Hyde. So it's about 3 to 5 minutes long, but you get to hear a 1909 performance version of Jekyll transforming into Hyde, and done for dramatic effect, but again from 1909, so it gives a different historical perspective to how this story has always held the public fascination over the years, and how it's sort of changed with the styles of the time in terms of performance and media in that particular time period. So those are all of the extras here, and it is a more substantial extras package than any previous release. So I think all of the extras here are a great source of historical curiosity and historical importance, and they're all tying into being various other versions of the iconic story that's, again, never left the public consciousness. So those are my thoughts on Kino's release of the 1920 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring the incomparable John Barrymore. I do think it is the best version of the film released on video to date. Unfortunately, I don't think it's perfect, and there is significant room for improvement if somebody will put the money and effort into a brand new scan and restoration. Until that point, though, this would be the version I would recommend to people. It is the best looking, and aside from the distortion issues in the score, it sounds great, and I do really enjoy the score composed for this version. And there are a great selection of extras and other versions of Jekyll and Hyde before 1920 that are fascinating. So I do think it is a good overall package. You do get enough extras and supplements, and the transfer quality is increased to such that I do think it is a worthwhile investment picking up this Blu-ray. I know not everyone is a fan of paying the higher prices for silent films, and then usually there's little to no extras and maybe only a marginal increase in quality over the last cleaned up DVD. But this one is important because, of course, the last Kino disc was missing about 5 minutes of footage. That's here once again. So the film is actually complete. Again, it has not been meticulously restored, so you are going to notice a lot of problems, from missing frames to visible sprocket holes and hairs and scratches and tears and things, but it is in much better shape than previous versions. And I did throw on the old Image Laserdisc as well to do a sort of spot comparison, because that was a different restoration. And there are noticeable differences between the two. They're, as with most silent restorations, they are slightly different approaches and from entirely different sources. So I do think this Kino release is the best quality that is currently available, and of course it totally wipes the floor with all the crappy versions you find in the public domain releases and floating around online. There are occasionally some versions that pop up that are pretty decent, where somebody scanned a good print, but it's never going to match up to one of the, or really the best available current restoration. I do think the tinting is good. It's the best quality I've ever seen the 1920 Jekyll and Hyde in. And you do really want to see this in the best quality possible, because Barrymore's performance is that riveting, and it really sells the entire story. I mean, you come to this film for Barrymore's performance, not just in the transformation sequences, but as both Jekyll and Hyde, and the very distinct difference that he creates between the two personalities. Again, I think it is probably the most distinct difference you notice between the two versions of this character in any of the main three adaptations, because again, the script really hammers home the point that Jekyll himself is so saintly and so pure of spirit, so his descent into evil is the most tragic of any of the film versions of Jekyll and Hyde. And you see echoes of this and other things the 1920 version does in both the 1931 and 41 versions. So without this film, you wouldn't have either of the other two. And of course, the success of all three relaunched Jekyll and Hyde into the public's consciousness to further the story's hold on all of our imaginations. So without this film, you wouldn't have the two sound remakes. And without all three of them, we probably wouldn't talk about Jekyll and Hyde as much as we do today, and it wouldn't be as greatly in our public consciousness. But it must be stressed that all three versions heavily draw from the stage play version, which is significantly different from the original Stevenson novella. So we've never quite gotten a film that purely does Stevenson's original, which would be interesting to see someday if anybody decided to try it. But in any case, those are my thoughts on the Kino release. It is imperfect, but I do think it is the best version currently available. If you have any thoughts about this release or some of the other releases, or about this version of Jekyll and Hyde, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, keep supporting both studio labels and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep physical media and film culture alive. And thank you ever so much for watching.